World War I, often referred to as the Great War, was one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century, reshaping not only the political landscape of Europe but also the broader global order. Spanning from 1914 to 1918, it was a war of unprecedented scale, involving multiple nations, empires, and millions of soldiers. It was the first truly global conflict, fought across continents and oceans, introducing devastating new methods of warfare and leaving behind an enduring legacy that would shape the course of the 20th century. The war's significance extends far beyond the battlefield. It marked the collapse of empires, redrew borders, and set the stage for revolutions, economic crises, and the eventual rise of ideologies that would dominate global politics for the rest of the century. The war's aftermath influenced the geopolitical structure of the world, creating tensions that would ultimately lead to World War II just 2 decades later. Many of the conflicts and power struggles that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century can be traced back to decisions made during and immediately after World War I. The early 20th century was a time of immense political and economic change. Europe, which had long been the dominant global force, was deeply divided by alliances and rivalries. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other was the Triple Entente, composed of Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were meant to maintain a balance of power, but in reality, they created a fragile situation in which a single conflict could escalate into a full-scale war. This system of alliances ensured that if one nation was attacked, its allies would be compelled to respond, effectively turning regional disputes into global conflicts. Imperialism also played a crucial role in heightening tensions among European powers. The competition for colonies and economic dominance had created deep rivalries, particularly between Britain, France, and Germany. European nations had spent decades expanding their empires into Africa and Asia, often clashing over territory and resources. Germany, a latecomer to imperial expansion, sought to challenge British and French dominance, leading to repeated diplomatic confrontations. This imperial competition was not limited to economic concerns. It was also deeply tied to national prestige, fueling nationalist sentiments that made war seem inevitable. Nationalism, in particular, was a powerful force driving Europe toward conflict. Many ethnic groups sought independence from larger empires, creating instability, especially in the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which controlled a diverse mix of ethnic groups, struggled to maintain unity in the face of growing nationalist movements. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire was weakening, leading to further instability in the region. Meanwhile, Germany's growing nationalism encouraged militarism, fostering a belief that war was not only inevitable but necessary for national greatness. The immediate trigger for World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, was a member of a Serbian nationalist group seeking independence for Slavic peoples under Austro-Hungarian rule. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which ultimately led to war. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic nations, mobilized in defense of Serbia, setting off a chain reaction that pulled in the major European powers. Within weeks, what had started as a regional conflict had spiraled into a world war. While the war was initially expected to be short, lasting only a few months, it quickly became clear that it would be a prolonged and grueling conflict. The widespread use of trench warfare on the Western Front led to years of stalemates, where neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Soldiers lived in horrific conditions, battling disease, cold, and constant artillery bombardments. New weapons such as machine guns, poison gas, and tanks changed the nature of warfare, making it deadlier than ever before. The war also introduced air combat and submarine warfare, further expanding the battlefield beyond traditional land engagements. The impact of World War I was not limited to Europe. The war drew in nations from around the world, including the United States, Japan, and many colonial troops from Africa and Asia. The involvement of colonial soldiers highlighted the global nature of the conflict and contributed to growing anti-colonial sentiments in the decades that followed. Many soldiers from British and French colonies fought in Europe, only to return home to societies that still denied them equal rights, fueling movements for independence. Economically, the war devastated Europe, draining national treasuries and causing widespread destruction. Nations took on massive debts to finance their war efforts, leading to economic instability that would last for years. Inflation soared, industries collapsed, and millions of people were left unemployed. The war also disrupted global trade, affecting economies far beyond Europe. The economic consequences of the war contributed to the conditions that led to the Great Depression in the 1930s, which in turn created fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies like fascism and communism. Socially, World War I brought about profound changes. Women played a significant role in the war effort, working in factories, serving as nurses, and even taking on roles traditionally held by men. This shift helped advance the cause of women's rights, leading to greater political and social recognition in many countries. In Britain and the United States, for example, women gained the right to vote shortly after the war, partly as a result of their contributions during the conflict. The war also reshaped class structures, as the old aristocracy weakened and new social movements emerged demanding better wages, working conditions, and political representation. The war's legacy is immense, and its consequences continue to shape the modern world. It fundamentally changed how wars were fought, introducing new technology and tactics that would be used in future conflicts. It also led to the downfall of several great empires, including the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires, redrawing the map of Europe and the Middle East. In Russia, the war played a direct role in the Bolshevik Revolution, leading to the establishment of the Soviet Union and the global ideological battle between communism and capitalism. Perhaps the most significant and lasting consequence of World War I was its role in setting the stage for World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including massive reparations, territorial losses, and strict military limitations. These conditions created deep resentment among the German people, fueling the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The treaty, rather than securing peace, planted the seeds for an even deadlier conflict just 2 decades later. World War I is remembered as the Great War because of its unprecedented scale and impact. It was a war that redefined global politics, warfare, and society, marking the end of the old world order and the beginning of a new, more volatile era. It shattered the illusion that war could be quick or glorious, exposing the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare. It also left behind unresolved tensions that would shape the conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. In many ways, World War I was not just a conflict between nations but a turning point in human history, the consequences of which continue to be felt to this day. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 was not the result of a single event but rather the culmination of decades of rising tensions, power struggles, and unresolved conflicts. The intricate web of alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and economic competition that defined Europe in the early 20th century created an environment where even a small crisis could escalate into a global war. While the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is often cited as the immediate trigger, the deeper causes of the war were rooted in long-standing rivalries and political maneuvering that had been building for years. Understanding these factors helps explain why the war spread so quickly and why it became one of the most devastating conflicts in history. One of the most significant factors leading to World War I was the system of alliances that divided Europe into 2 opposing camps. By the early 20th century, European nations had formed military agreements to protect themselves from potential threats. However, instead of ensuring stability, these alliances created a fragile balance of power, where a conflict between 2 nations could rapidly draw in multiple others, transforming a local dispute into a continent-wide war. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This alliance was primarily defensive, created by Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to ensure that France remained diplomatically isolated. Austria-Hungary, a weakening empire facing internal nationalist movements, saw the alliance as a means of securing its influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Italy, though a member, had its own imperial ambitions and was not as committed to the alliance as its partners. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, which brought together Britain, France, and Russia. This alliance was less formal but was built upon growing concerns about Germany's ambitions. France, still bitter over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, sought security against Germany. Russia, with its interests in the Balkans and long-standing rivalry with Austria-Hungary, aligned itself with France. Britain, initially hesitant to engage in European alliances, joined in response to Germany's growing naval power and its increasingly aggressive foreign policy. These alliances ensured that any conflict involving one major power would likely involve all the others. Instead of preventing war, they created a dangerous situation where nations were bound by treaties to defend their allies, even in disputes where their own interests were not directly at stake. The sense of security provided by alliances also encouraged more aggressive diplomacy, as nations believed they could act without facing the consequences alone. While alliances played a crucial role in setting the stage for war, nationalism added fuel to the fire. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a surge in nationalist movements across Europe, particularly in the Balkans. Nationalism fostered both unity and division. While it strengthened existing nations, it also threatened multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Nowhere was nationalism more volatile than in the Balkans, often referred to as the powder keg of Europe. Various ethnic groups sought independence from larger empires, leading to repeated conflicts. Serbia, in particular, emerged as a center of Slavic nationalism, advocating for the creation of a greater Slavic state that would include Serbs living under Austro-Hungarian rule. This directly clashed with Austria-Hungary's interests, as the empire ruled over a diverse population, including millions of Slavs who resented foreign rule. Serbia's expansion following the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, further alarmed Austria-Hungary, which saw a strong Serbia as a threat to its territorial integrity. Panslavism, the idea that all Slavic peoples should be united under Russian protection, heightened tensions. Russia, positioning itself as the defender of Slavic nations, increasingly supported Serbia, worsening relations with Austria-Hungary. This dynamic made any conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary likely to draw in Russia, escalating the crisis beyond the Balkans. Beyond nationalist tensions, imperialism played a key role in increasing hostility among European powers. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw European nations competing for colonial dominance in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The most intense competition was between Britain, France, and Germany. Britain, the world's dominant colonial power, had built an empire spanning continents, ensuring its economic supremacy. France, though still powerful, had been weakened by the Franco-Prussian War and sought to expand its empire, particularly in Africa. Germany, a relatively new power that had unified in 1871, was eager to assert itself on the global stage. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany aggressively pursued overseas territories, challenging Britain and France. The Moroccan crises, 1905 and 1911, were direct examples of this conflict. Germany attempted to undermine French control over Morocco, leading to international standoffs. These events only pushed Britain and France closer together, strengthening the Entente. Economic competition further deepened divisions. Germany's industrial growth was remarkable, rivaling Britain's economy by the early 20th century. German steel and coal production surpassed Britain's, and its military buildup, particularly its naval expansion, threatened Britain's dominance at sea. The Anglo-German naval arms race saw Germany rapidly expanding its fleet, challenging Britain's Royal Navy. Britain, in response, felt compelled to strengthen its own naval forces, further deteriorating relations. This competition was not just about military strength, it was about economic survival. Britain relied on its navy to protect trade routes and maintain its empire, while Germany sought to break British dominance through military and industrial power. The growing sense of economic rivalry meant that even minor disputes could escalate into larger confrontations. While the broader causes of war had been developing for decades, The immediate trigger was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. On June 28, 1914, while visiting Sarajevo, Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908, Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Serbian nationalist group the Black Hand. Austria-Hungary saw the assassination as a direct attack on its authority and blamed Serbia for supporting nationalist terrorism. The empire issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding extreme concessions, including allowing Austrian officials to investigate Serbian involvement in the assassination. Serbia, backed by Russia, refused some of the demands, leading Austria-Hungary to declare war on July 28, 1914. What followed was a chain reaction. Russia, bound by its pan-Slavic commitments, began mobilizing against Austria-Hungary. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia on August 1. France, allied with Russia, was drawn in against Germany. Germany's invasion of Belgium on August 4 brought Britain into the war, as Britain had pledged to defend Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, what had begun as a regional conflict had escalated into a full-scale European war. In the weeks leading up to the war, there were several missed opportunities for diplomatic resolution. The period known as the July Crisis saw frantic negotiations between European powers, but distrust and rigid military plans made compromise impossible. One of the key moments was Germany's blank check to Austria-Hungary. On July 5, 1914, Germany assured Austria-Hungary that it would support any action taken against Serbia. This emboldened Austria-Hungary to take a hardline stance, making war almost inevitable. Britain, which could have played a mediating role, remained uncertain. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey made some attempts at peaceful arbitration, but Britain's official stance remained unclear until Germany invaded Belgium. By then, it was too late to prevent a wider war. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, designed to avoid a two-front war by quickly defeating France before turning to Russia, required invading Belgium. This move violated Belgium's neutrality, a status Britain had guaranteed. As a result, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, completing the process that turned a Balkan crisis into a global war. The road to World War I was paved with complex and interwoven causes, from the rigid alliance system and nationalist ambitions to imperial rivalries and economic competition. While the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the immediate trigger, the deeper causes had been developing for decades. Once war broke out, diplomatic efforts failed to contain it, leading to a devastating conflict that would reshape the world for generations to come. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 led to an immediate and widespread conflict across multiple fronts. The war, initially expected to be short, rapidly escalated into a prolonged and grueling struggle that engulfed Europe and beyond. Each major theater of war saw intense battles, shifting strategies, and dramatic consequences that shaped the course of the conflict. The war was not confined to the trenches of France and Belgium. It extended to the Eastern Front, the Middle East, and the seas, where naval power played a crucial role in determining the war's outcome. The failure of quick victories and the entrenchment of opposing forces led to a war of attrition, where both sides sought to exhaust their enemy rather than achieve decisive battlefield triumphs. Germany entered the war with a carefully devised military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, which aimed to avoid a two-front war by swiftly defeating France before turning to face Russia. The plan relied on rapid movement, with German forces sweeping through Belgium and into northern France to encircle Paris. However, the invasion of Belgium provoked an unexpected and determined resistance. The small Belgian army, despite being heavily outnumbered, managed to slow down the German advance, particularly in the fortified city of Liège. This resistance gave Britain time to mobilize its forces and declare war on Germany in response to the violation of Belgian neutrality. British and French forces, though initially retreating under German pressure, regrouped along the Marne River, setting the stage for one of the war's most crucial battles. The First Battle of the Marne in September 1914 marked a turning point on the Western Front. German forces had advanced dangerously close to Paris, but a combined Franco-British counteroffensive halted their momentum. Over 1 million soldiers fought in the battle, and the use of taxis to transport French troops to the front became an enduring symbol of national resistance. The German retreat led to the establishment of static defensive lines, as both sides began digging trenches that would define the nature of warfare for the next 4 years. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant that Germany was now engaged in the very two-front war it had sought to avoid, leading to prolonged and bloody trench warfare. While the Western Front became a stagnant battleground of trenches, the Eastern Front saw a more fluid and dynamic conflict. Russia, aiming to relieve pressure on its French allies, launched an early invasion of East Prussia, forcing Germany to divert resources eastward. However, the Russian offensive was poorly coordinated, leading to disastrous defeats at the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914. Under the command of General Paul von Hindenburg and his chief strategist Erich Ludendorff, German forces encircled and annihilated the Russian Second Army, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners and severely damaging Russian morale. Tannenberg was followed by the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, another crushing German victory that further weakened Russian forces. Austria-Hungary, Germany's key ally, struggled significantly in the early battles against Russia. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered severe losses in Galicia, where Russian troops overwhelmed their positions. The empire's weaknesses became evident as poor coordination, logistical failures, and internal divisions hampered its military effectiveness. While Germany managed to hold its ground in the north, Austria-Hungary required constant German support to avoid collapse. The Eastern Front's battles remained fluid, with massive offensives and retreats, unlike the stalemate in the West. Russia's early setbacks did not immediately remove it from the war, but they exposed the inefficiency of its military command and the vulnerabilities of the Tsarist regime. Beyond Europe, the war extended into the Middle East with the Ottoman Empire's entry into the conflict in late 1914. The Ottomans, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary, opened new fronts against the British and their allies. One of the most significant campaigns in this theater was the Gallipoli Campaign, an ambitious but ultimately disastrous attempt by the Allies to seize control of the Dardanelles Strait and open a supply route to Russia. British and French forces, under the direction of Winston Churchill, launched amphibious landings in April 1915, but strong Ottoman defenses under Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, repelled the attacks. The campaign turned into a prolonged and bloody stalemate, with thousands of soldiers dying in trench warfare reminiscent of the Western Front. After months of failed offensives, the Allies withdrew in early 1916, marking a major victory for the Ottomans. Meanwhile, in the Arabian Peninsula, British support for Arab nationalist movements helped incite the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Led by figures such as T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, the revolt saw Arab forces conducting guerrilla warfare against the Ottomans, disrupting their supply lines and weakening their control over the region. The revolt played a significant role in shaping the post-war Middle East, as British promises of Arab independence conflicted with secret agreements to divide Ottoman territories among European powers. These events laid the groundwork for future geopolitical conflicts in the region, particularly regarding British and French mandates in former Ottoman lands. The war was not fought solely on land. Naval power played a crucial role in determining the conflict's direction. The most significant naval engagement of the war was the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where the British Royal Navy faced off against the German High Seas Fleet. This was the largest naval battle of the war, involving over 250 ships and resulting in heavy losses on both sides. Although tactically inconclusive, Jutland reaffirmed British naval dominance, as the German fleet remained largely confined to its ports for the remainder of the war. Germany, recognizing that it could not defeat Britain in a direct naval confrontation, turned to unrestricted submarine warfare as a means of disrupting Allied supply lines. German U-boats targeted both military and civilian vessels, including neutral ships suspected of carrying supplies to the Allies. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, which resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 civilians, including Americans, provoked international outrage and brought the United States closer to joining the war. The submarine campaign was a double-edged sword, as it strained relations with neutral nations and ultimately contributed to the U.S. decision to enter the war in 1917. In response to the U-boat threat, Britain implemented a naval blockade against Germany, aiming to cut off essential supplies and starve the German war effort. The blockade was highly effective, leading to severe food shortages and economic distress in Germany. By 1916, German civilians were suffering from widespread malnutrition, with rationing and food substitutes becoming a necessity. The blockade's long-term impact weakened German resolve and contributed to growing unrest within the country, setting the stage for internal strife that would later play a role in Germany's surrender. The early years of World War I shattered initial expectations of a short and decisive conflict. The failure of Germany's Schlieffen Plan, the brutal trench warfare on the Western Front, the devastating battles on the Eastern Front, and the expansion of the war into the Middle East and the seas all contributed to the war's transformation into a prolonged and global struggle. The war had evolved beyond traditional battlefield engagements. It became a test of endurance, resources, and national willpower. The strategies and battles of these early years shaped the remainder of the conflict, leading to an ever-escalating war that would continue to consume millions of lives. Trench warfare became the defining feature of World War I, symbolizing the brutal and stagnant nature of the conflict. What had begun as a war of rapid movement quickly turned into a grueling and seemingly endless struggle fought from deep, muddy trenches that stretched across hundreds of miles. The Western Front, in particular, became a vast network of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire where millions of soldiers lived, fought, and died under horrific conditions. Life in the trenches was a constant battle not only against the enemy but also against the elements, disease, and psychological torment. Soldiers endured a miserable existence, surrounded by filth, death, and the ever-present threat of artillery bombardments. A soldier's daily routine in the trenches revolved around survival. They were exposed to the elements, often standing knee-deep in freezing mud, leading to conditions like trench foot, where prolonged exposure to dampness caused painful swelling, infection, and sometimes amputation. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on corpses and leftover food scraps, growing to enormous sizes and spreading disease. Lice infestations were rampant, causing unbearable itching and leading to trench fever, a painful illness that weakened many soldiers. The lack of proper sanitation made the spread of infections inevitable, and the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and decomposing corpses hung heavy in the air. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological toll of trench warfare was immense. Soldiers lived in constant fear of sudden artillery barrages, sniper fire, and poison gas attacks. The enemy was often just a few hundred yards away, yet engaging in combat meant charging into open ground, no man's land, where machine gun fire and barbed wire made survival nearly impossible. No Man's Land was a desolate, crater-filled wasteland, littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers who could not be retrieved due to the risk of enemy fire. At night, soldiers would conduct dangerous patrols in this deadly zone, gathering intelligence or attempting to repair barbed wire defenses. Amidst the horrors of trench warfare, one of the war's most remarkable moments of humanity occurred during the Christmas Truce of 1914. Along certain sections of the Western Front, soldiers from opposing sides spontaneously ceased fighting, exchanging greetings, singing carols, and even playing football in no man's land. For a brief moment, the soldiers recognized their shared suffering, ignoring orders from their commanders to continue the war. However, this truce was short-lived, and the fighting soon resumed with even greater ferocity. Some of the war's most infamous battles were fought in the trenches, with millions of lives lost in futile offensives that resulted in little to no territorial gain. The Battle of Verdun, fought between Germany and France in 1916, became one of the longest and most grueling battles of the war. Germany sought to bleed France white by launching a relentless assault on the fortress city of Verdun, believing that the French would defend it at all costs. The battle lasted for nearly 10 months, with both sides suffering massive casualties. The French, under the leadership of General Philippe Pétain, held their ground with the rallying cry, "They shall not pass." Verdun became a symbol of French resilience, but at a terrible cost. Over 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Meanwhile, the British launched the Battle of the Somme in an attempt to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. On July 1, 1916, British forces initiated one of the most disastrous attacks in military history. The first day of the battle saw nearly 60,000 British casualties, making it the bloodiest single day in British military history. Over the course of the months-long battle, new weapons, such as the tank, were introduced, but they had little impact in breaking the deadlock. The Somme exemplified the futility of trench warfare. After months of relentless fighting, the Allies gained just a few miles of ground at the cost of over 1 million casualties. The Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele, took place in 1917 and further demonstrated the horrors of trench warfare. Heavy rains turned the battlefield into a swamp of thick mud, swallowing men, horses, and equipment. The battle was characterized by the sheer misery of fighting in these conditions, with soldiers struggling to move through knee-deep sludge while under relentless shelling. Despite months of effort, the British and Commonwealth forces only managed to advance a few miles, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Passchendaele became a symbol of senseless slaughter and the harsh realities of World War I. The psychological impact of trench warfare on soldiers was profound. Many suffered from shell shock, a condition now recognized as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The relentless noise of artillery, the constant fear of death, and the sight of friends being torn apart left many soldiers mentally broken. Symptoms included uncontrollable shaking, nightmares, severe anxiety, and an inability to function. At the time, many military leaders viewed shell shock as a sign of cowardice, and some soldiers were even executed for desertion or refusal to fight. However, as cases grew, medical professionals began studying the effects of war trauma, leading to the early foundations of modern PTSD research. Another terrifying aspect of trench warfare was the introduction of chemical weapons, most notably poison gas. Chlorine gas, phosgene, and mustard gas were used to devastating effect, causing suffocation, blindness, and excruciating burns. Mustard gas, in particular, was notorious for lingering on the battlefield for days, infecting clothing and soil, and causing slow, painful deaths. Soldiers equipped themselves with gas masks, but these were often ineffective or difficult to use in the chaos of battle. The use of chemical weapons violated long-standing conventions on the rules of war, but their impact was so horrifying that they were eventually banned after World War I. Despite the carnage, the war also led to advancements in battlefield medicine. The sheer scale of casualties forced medical personnel to develop new techniques in trauma care. Mobile field hospitals were established closer to the front lines, allowing for quicker treatment of wounded soldiers. Blood transfusions became more common, and antiseptics were more widely used to prevent infections. The war also accelerated the development of prosthetics, as thousands of soldiers returned home with amputated limbs. These medical advancements laid the groundwork for modern emergency medicine and surgery. Trench warfare turned World War I into a war of attrition, where the goal was not necessarily to win territory but to wear down the enemy through sheer exhaustion and loss of life. The brutal conditions, the staggering casualty rates, and the psychological trauma made life in the trenches one of the most harrowing experiences in military history. Soldiers fought not only against their enemies but against the unrelenting hardships of the trenches themselves. The legacy of trench warfare would endure long after the war ended, shaping military tactics, medical practices, and the collective memory of those who endured the horrors of the Great War. Trench warfare and prolonged stalemates on the battlefield led to significant innovations in military technology during World War I. Armies on both sides sought ways to break the deadlock and gain an advantage over their enemies. The war saw the introduction of new weapons and strategies that would forever change the nature of warfare. From the introduction of tanks and aircraft to the devastating power of machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons, the conflict became a proving ground for modern military tactics. Additionally, the entry of the United States into the war in 1917 marked a turning point that contributed to the eventual Allied victory. One of the most significant technological innovations of the war was the introduction of tanks. Before their arrival, trench warfare had rendered traditional battlefield maneuvers ineffective, as soldiers attempting to cross no man's land were cut down by machine gun fire. The British were the first to deploy tanks during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. These early tanks, such as the Mark I, were slow, unreliable, and often broke down in battle. However, despite their mechanical issues, tanks demonstrated the potential to overcome barbed wire defenses and provide much-needed support to infantry attacks. Over time, tank designs improved, and they became a crucial component of modern warfare. By the end of the war, tanks played a significant role in breaking through enemy lines, particularly during the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, where a large-scale tank offensive demonstrated their effectiveness in combined arms operations. While tanks transformed ground warfare, air combat emerged as another revolutionary development. In the early years of the war, aircraft were primarily used for reconnaissance, gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements and artillery positions. However, as the war progressed, aircraft were equipped with machine guns, leading to the rise of fighter planes and aerial dogfights. Pilots engaged in deadly one-on-one combat, and some became celebrated war heroes. One of the most famous fighter aces was Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, a German pilot who achieved over 80 aerial victories before being shot down in 1918. Alongside fighter planes, bombers became an essential tool for attacking enemy infrastructure and supply lines. Strategic bombing campaigns were still in their infancy, but they laid the foundation for future air warfare. By the end of the war, aircraft had proven their value, leading to the rapid expansion of air forces in the years that followed. On the ground, machine guns and artillery became the most devastating weapons of the war. Traditional military tactics, which emphasized massed infantry charges, were rendered obsolete in the face of rapid, continuous gunfire. A single well-positioned machine gun could mow down entire waves of advancing soldiers, making direct assaults on enemy positions extremely costly. As a result, armies were forced to develop new tactics, such as creeping barrages, in which artillery fire moved ahead of advancing troops to suppress enemy defenders. Artillery bombardments became the primary means of softening enemy defenses before major offensives, with battles such as Verdun and the Somme witnessing weeks of continuous shelling. The scale of artillery warfare was unprecedented, with millions of shells fired throughout the war. The psychological impact of these bombardments was immense, leading to widespread cases of shell shock among soldiers who endured the relentless explosions. One of the most terrifying developments of the war was the introduction of chemical weapons. Poison gas was first used on a large scale by the Germans during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. Chlorine gas caused panic and suffocation among unprepared Allied troops, leading to severe casualties. Soon after, both sides began using increasingly deadly chemical agents, including phosgene and mustard gas. Mustard gas was particularly horrific, causing severe burns, internal bleeding, and blindness. Unlike other chemical agents, it lingered in the air and contaminated the battlefield for days. The unpredictable nature of gas warfare, coupled with its horrific effects, led to widespread condemnation. Although gas masks and protective measures were developed to counteract these attacks, chemical weapons remained one of the war's most feared innovations. The horrors of gas warfare ultimately led to international agreements banning their use, such as the Geneva Protocol of 1925, but their impact on the war was undeniable. The technological advancements of World War I changed the way wars were fought, but the war also had a geopolitical impact that reshaped the world order. One of the most significant events of the later years of the war was the entry of the United States in 1917. Initially, the United States had maintained a policy of neutrality, but several factors eventually pushed the nation into the conflict. One of the key reasons was Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats targeted Allied shipping, sinking merchant vessels and passenger ships without warning. The most infamous incident occurred in 1915 when the British ocean liner Lusitania was torpedoed, killing over 1,000 passengers, including 128 Americans. Although the U.S. did not enter the war immediately after this event, public opinion increasingly turned against Germany. Another major factor was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret communication sent by Germany to Mexico in early 1917. In the telegram, German officials proposed an alliance with Mexico, promising to support Mexican territorial claims against the United States in exchange for military cooperation. When British intelligence intercepted and revealed the message, it outraged the American public and further solidified the case for war. Combined with economic ties to the Allies, who relied on American financial and material support, these events led President Woodrow Wilson to request a declaration of war against Germany in April 1917. The arrival of American troops on the Western Front provided a much-needed morale boost for the Allies. The American Expeditionary Forces, EF, led by General John J. Pershing, brought fresh soldiers and resources to a war-weary battlefield. Unlike the exhausted European armies, American troops were well-rested and eager to prove themselves. Although they initially lacked combat experience, their presence alone signaled to Germany that the balance of power had shifted. By mid-1918, American forces played a crucial role in key battles, such as the Battle of Cantigny, the Second Battle of the Marne, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. These engagements helped push back German forces and hasten the war's conclusion. Beyond their battlefield contributions, the United States also played a crucial role in shaping the post-war order. President Wilson's vision for peace was outlined in his 14 points, a proposal aimed at preventing future conflicts by promoting self-determination, free trade, and the establishment of the League of Nations. While Wilson's ideas were influential, the harsh realities of post-war negotiations, particularly at the Treaty of Versailles, overshadowed his vision. Nevertheless, America's intervention in World War I marked the beginning of its rise as a global superpower, setting the stage for its involvement in future international conflicts. The war's technological and strategic shifts had lasting effects on military doctrine and global politics. The introduction of tanks, aircraft, machine guns, and chemical weapons demonstrated the importance of innovation in warfare. The psychological and physical toll on soldiers led to new understandings of trauma and the need for improved medical care. The United States' entry into the war highlighted the growing interconnectedness of global affairs and the importance of alliances. By the end of the war, the world had changed forever. The old ways of war had been shattered, replaced by mechanized, industrialized conflict that would define the 20th century. The lessons learned from World War I influenced military strategies in future conflicts, particularly in World War II. While the Treaty of Versailles sought to bring lasting peace, its harsh terms set the stage for future tensions, proving that the war's impact would be felt for decades to come. The introduction of new technologies and the involvement of the United States reshaped the global order, ensuring that World War I would not be the last great conflict of the modern age. The final year of World War I marked a turning point as the Allies launched a relentless series of offensives that ultimately shattered German resistance. By mid-1918, the tide of war had shifted decisively in favor of the Allied forces. After years of grueling trench warfare and attritional battles, the 100 Days Offensive proved to be the decisive campaign that forced Germany and its allies into retreat. Beginning in August 1918, the offensive involved a coordinated assault by British, French, American, and Canadian forces. Unlike earlier campaigns, the Allies effectively combined infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support, making significant breakthroughs across the Western Front. The Battle of Amiens, which initiated the offensive, demonstrated how far military tactics had evolved since the early years of the war. The German army, exhausted and demoralized, struggled to hold its ground as Allied forces pressed forward. Over the next 3 months, the Central Powers suffered heavy losses, and their defensive lines crumbled under the relentless assaults. As the Allies advanced, the situation for Germany and its allies became increasingly desperate. Austria-Hungary was on the brink of collapse, with internal divisions and uprisings threatening to dismantle the empire. The Ottoman Empire, too, faced mounting defeats in the Middle East. With its allies falling apart, Germany found itself in an untenable position. On the home front, war fatigue, food shortages, and growing dissent among the German population put immense pressure on the government to seek peace. By November 1918, German military leaders acknowledged that victory was impossible, and negotiations for an armistice began. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, signaling the end of imperial rule in Germany. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed, officially ending the fighting. Across Europe and beyond, celebrations erupted as people rejoiced at the prospect of peace. However, the cost of the war was staggering. More than 16 million people had died, and millions more were wounded or displaced. Entire cities and regions were devastated, economies were in ruins, and the psychological scars of the conflict ran deep. Despite the relief that the war had ended, there was also uncertainty about what would come next. The world had changed irrevocably, and the peace settlement that followed would shape the course of the 20th century. In 1919, world leaders gathered at the Palace of Versailles in France to negotiate the terms of peace. The Treaty of Versailles was the most significant of the post-war treaties and imposed harsh conditions on Germany. The treaty's terms were dictated primarily by the Allied powers, particularly Britain, France, and the United States. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under the infamous Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause. This clause justified imposing severe reparations on Germany, requiring it to pay enormous sums to compensate for the damage caused by the war. Additionally, Germany was stripped of its overseas colonies, lost significant territories in Europe, and faced severe restrictions on its military capabilities. The treaty also established the League of Nations, an international organization intended to prevent future conflicts and promote peace. However, the League had significant weaknesses from the outset. The United States, despite President Woodrow Wilson's advocacy for its creation, never joined due to opposition in the U.S. Senate. Furthermore, the League lacked enforcement mechanisms, making it ineffective in dealing with future aggressors. Many Germans viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliating diktat imposed upon them without fair negotiation. The resentment it fostered would have long-term consequences, contributing to political instability in Germany and fueling nationalist sentiments. Beyond Germany, the aftermath of the war saw the collapse of several major empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, leading to the emergence of new nations such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened before the war, was dismantled, with its remaining territories divided among the victorious powers. The Russian Empire had collapsed into revolution in 1917, leading to the rise of the Soviet Union. These geopolitical shifts created a radically different world map, but they also left unresolved tensions that would later contribute to future conflicts. The economic consequences of the war were profound. The destruction of infrastructure, loss of manpower, and massive war debts crippled many European economies. Germany, burdened by reparations, struggled with hyperinflation and economic instability throughout the 1920s. France and Britain, despite being on the winning side, also faced significant economic difficulties. The post-war period saw a fragile economic recovery, but the instability created by the war laid the foundation for the Great Depression of the 1930s. The global economic crisis that followed further deepened political divisions and facilitated the rise of extremist movements. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles and economic turmoil fueled widespread resentment, particularly among nationalist groups. Many Germans believed they had been unfairly blamed for the war and sought to overturn the treaty's harsh conditions. This resentment was skillfully exploited by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who used nationalist propaganda to rally support. Hitler portrayed the treaty as a betrayal and promised to restore Germany's lost glory. His ability to channel public anger into a political movement allowed him to rise to power in 1933. Once in control, Hitler began systematically dismantling the treaty's restrictions, rebuilding Germany's military and expanding its territorial ambitions. The League of Nations, which was meant to prevent future wars, proved ineffective in addressing growing aggression. Japan, dissatisfied with the post-war settlement, invaded Manchuria in 1931, while Italy, under Benito Mussolini, launched an aggressive campaign in Africa. The League failed to respond effectively to these acts of aggression, emboldening expansionist leaders. Meanwhile, Hitler openly defied the Treaty of Versailles by rearming Germany, remilitarizing the Rhineland, and annexing Austria. Despite these blatant violations, Britain and France pursued a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another devastating war. The unresolved tensions of World War I and the failures of the post-war settlement directly led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The Treaty of Versailles had attempted to create a lasting peace but instead sowed the seeds of future conflict. The economic hardships, political instability, and nationalist fervor it fueled provided the perfect conditions for the rise of totalitarian regimes. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, it marked the beginning of another global war, one that would be even more destructive than the last. The legacy of World War I demonstrated the dangers of punitive peace settlements and the importance of addressing the root causes of conflict rather than simply imposing harsh penalties on defeated nations. In retrospect, World War I was a turning point in world history. It not only reshaped political borders but also introduced new forms of warfare, economic challenges, and ideological struggles that would define the 20th century. The war's aftermath demonstrated how fragile peace could be if grievances were left unresolved. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the collapse of empires, and the economic turmoil that followed created a volatile environment that made World War II almost inevitable. The lessons of World War I continue to be studied as a reminder of the complexities of war, diplomacy, and the long-term consequences of global conflict. World War I was more than just a conflict between powerful nations. It was a transformative event that reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. It fundamentally altered global politics, warfare, and diplomacy, leaving a legacy that influenced the course of the 20th century and beyond. The war's unprecedented scale, the destruction it caused, and the geopolitical consequences that followed changed the way nations interacted, how wars were fought, and how peace was maintained. It was not just a war between soldiers on battlefields. It was a war that impacted civilians, economies, and entire societies. The world before 1914 was significantly different from the one that emerged in 1918, and the scars of that change shaped the modern era in profound ways. One of the most immediate and lasting effects of World War I was the redrawing of global political boundaries. The collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires led to the creation of new nations and the restructuring of old ones. The Treaty of Versailles and other post-war agreements divided territories and imposed new governments, often without considering the historical, ethnic, or cultural complexities of the regions involved. This arbitrary redrawing of borders created tensions that would later contribute to conflicts, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The League of Nations was established to maintain peace, but without true enforcement power and with key nations refusing to participate fully, it proved ineffective in preventing future aggression. The war also changed the way nations approached warfare. The technological advancements seen during World War I made clear that modern warfare would be far more devastating than anything that had come before. The use of machine guns, artillery, chemical weapons, tanks, and aircraft revolutionized combat and made old military tactics obsolete. The brutality of trench warfare and the mass casualties it caused forced military strategists to rethink how wars were fought. The lessons of World War I were applied in World War II, where new forms of mechanized warfare, air power, and total war strategies emerged. The horrors of chemical warfare eventually led to international treaties banning their use, though the development of even deadlier weapons continued, culminating in nuclear warfare by the mid-20th century. Diplomatically, World War I set a precedent for international cooperation, but also for punitive peace settlements that could lead to further conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to prevent Germany from ever waging war again, but its harsh terms only fueled resentment and economic turmoil. The failure of diplomacy in the lead-up to World War I was echoed in the post-war period, as nations struggled to maintain peace while dealing with economic crises and political instability. The inability of the League of Nations to enforce its mandates demonstrated the weaknesses of international governance, a lesson that would later influence the creation of the United Nations after World War II. The concept of collective security, where nations work together to prevent aggression, became a central principle of international relations, but it was clear that it required stronger enforcement mechanisms than those established after World War I. The economic consequences of the war were profound and far-reaching. The destruction of infrastructure, loss of manpower, and massive war debts placed significant burdens on many nations. Germany, in particular, faced extreme economic hardship due to the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and social unrest in the 1920s created the perfect conditions for the rise of extremist political movements. The global economic instability that followed, including the Great Depression of the 1930s, can be traced back in part to the economic disruptions caused by the war. The economic suffering and uncertainty that gripped many parts of the world contributed to the rise of authoritarian leaders who promised stability, ultimately leading to the outbreak of World War II. The social impact of World War I was just as significant as its political and economic effects. The war had been fought on an unprecedented scale, with millions of men mobilized from across the world. The sheer scale of the casualties and the suffering endured by soldiers and civilians alike left deep psychological scars. The concept of shell shock, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, emerged as a recognition of the mental toll of warfare. Veterans returned home to societies that had been fundamentally changed, and many struggled to reintegrate. The war also played a role in changing gender roles, as women took on new responsibilities in the workforce while men were away fighting. Though progress was slow, the war contributed to the eventual expansion of women's rights, particularly in terms of suffrage and workforce participation. Colonial subjects who had fought for European powers also began to question their subordinate status. Soldiers from India, Africa, and other colonies had fought and died for empires that had long treated them as second-class citizens. In the years following the war, nationalist movements gained momentum, with leaders in colonized nations pushing for independence. Though many of these struggles would take decades to achieve full sovereignty, the war had planted the seeds of decolonization, setting the stage for the dismantling of colonial empires after World War II. The war's legacy extends beyond history books and into modern conflicts. The lessons learned from World War I continue to influence military strategy, international relations, and peacekeeping efforts. The dangers of rigid alliances, the consequences of economic instability, and the risks of punitive peace settlements remain relevant to this day. The failures of the League of Nations led to the establishment of the United Nations, with stronger mechanisms for conflict resolution. The horrors of World War I also played a role in shaping the Geneva Conventions and other international agreements designed to protect civilians and prisoners of war. Yet, despite all the lessons learned, the world has continued to experience conflicts driven by nationalism, economic competition, and political rivalry. Many of the unresolved tensions from World War I contributed directly to World War II, and even today, echoes of the war can be seen in territorial disputes, ethnic conflicts, and struggles for power. The legacy of the war serves as a reminder that history must be studied not only to understand the past but to prevent the mistakes of the past from being repeated. World War I was often called the war to end all wars, but the reality proved to be quite different. Instead of bringing lasting peace, it laid the groundwork for further conflicts. The war's impact on global politics, military strategy, economic systems, and social structures was profound, and its consequences continue to shape the world. Understanding its history allows us to see how interconnected the past and present truly are. The lessons of World War I, about the dangers of unchecked militarism, the importance of diplomacy, and the need for just and sustainable peace agreements, remain relevant today. As the world continues to navigate conflicts and geopolitical challenges, the experiences of World War I provide invaluable insights into the consequences of war and the importance of striving for peace.